My grandmother was Alice Guy, the first woman filmmaker in the world. You never heard of her? I can hardly blame you. For years, I myself thought that she was an ordinary grandmother. She had a cloud of white hair and wore funny hats and had soft, soft hands that I loved to stroke. I had no idea back then that this frail old woman had been one of the leading lights of her era, with an exceptional destiny. Grandmother was present at the birth of the cinema. She saw still pictures come to life. In fact, her youthful smile was immortalized in the very first moving pictures. "50 years later, another invention, television, captured her image and her voice.
Will
you not give me makeup?
You look lovely.
Her story began more than a century ago in France. She was born on the 1st of July, 1873, in Saint-Mandé, near Paris. She spent a happy childhood in Chile, where her father was a bookseller, until he lost everything and had to move the family back to Europe. In her late teens, with her father and brother dead, and her sisters married, she found herself alone to care for her aging mother.
Adrienne, I found some more.
Oh, yeah. I also found something.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. What is this?
Oh, it's the decoration. I don't know what this is, whether those are diamonds or garnets, but the lovely little purple ribbon. Mommy always wore the purple ribbon in her lapel. Maybe you remember. Not this one, but a little one of the same color.
Oh, yeah?
Yes,
I don't remember. I see this picture here also of her.
Oh, yes.
When was this taken?
Oh, she's so young there.
Yeah.
That was in Paris.
J'avais un ami, et ça a été, je dois dire, mon premier amour.
I had a friend. He was my first love, but he was 75 years old. I was 18, but I would gladly have married him. I adored the man. One day he said to my mother, the best thing for Alice would be to learn shorthand typing. It's something new and she could become a secretary in a company. And so I did. I learned very quickly. My teacher was the stenographer for la Chambre des députés, the French Parliament.
Il m'avait, je dirais pas, vu à part, mais enfin, il aimait.
He liked me and told me, the first good position to be offered will go to you. He soon sent word that there was an excellent position with Monsieur Richard at la Société de Photographie, which was not called Gaumont at the time. I arrived by heart pounding to apply for the post and was told that Monsieur Richard was not there. Noticing my disappointment, the person said, perhaps you could see Monsieur Gaumont, his representative. He was not yet the head of the company. Gaumont said, you come highly recommended, mademoiselle, but for such an important post, I fear you are too young. So I said, I will get over that. He laughed and said, yes, hélas, you will.
She was thrilled with her new job. She was young, and life spread before her, filled with promise.
I was, at the time, secretary for the Maison Gaumont. Monsieur de Mény came to the company with an invention. Gaumont, a man of science, immediately recognized the value of this device and began to manufacture one. Unfortunately, while we were still working on it, the Lumière brothers, who were friends with the people at Gaumont, came by with an invitation. I was in the office, and as a courtesy, they invited me as well. We went, I believe, to la Société d'encouragement aux sciences. The Lumières had put up a sheet and were cranking a small machine. We saw emerging the well-known classic footage of the exit from the Lumière factory. We returned very enthusiastic about the invention, but somewhat dismayed because work on the cinema apparatus of Domenech was already well underway. However, we persevered, and soon Gaumont developed a projector. The great discovery was, in fact, finding a method of projection. At that time, people were still filming street scenes, a train pulling into the station, etc. I was the daughter of a bookseller, and I loved books. I had read a great deal, and I had done some amateur theater, and I thought something better could be done. So I suggested to Monsieur Gaumont that I film a few scenes. He said, "It seems like a silly, girlish thing to do, but you can try if you want, on one condition, that your office work does not suffer."
You wrote the scenarios yourself?
They were not really scenarios. They were little stories that I made up.
What sort of stories?
La Fée aux Choux was the story of two young lovers who wanted children. We made cabbages out of cardboard and used wooden dolls for the babies, except for one. The mother was very nervous. The lovers found the baby in the cabbage patch. It was very simple. But we made others, which were more successful than I ever thought possible. I made Esmeralda, and I will give you a list of my films if you like.
Grandmother said they were able to sell 80 copies of her first film, La Fée aux Choux, or The Cabbage Fairy. Her boss, Léon Gaumont, pleased with this success and no doubt happy to be able to save a salary, appointed my grandmother head of all moving picture production at the House of Gaumont, while keeping her as a secretary and a girl Friday. But as time went on, she became less of a secretary and more of a filmmaker. At that time, neither the title nor the trade of filmmaker existed.
Alors Léon Gaumont, qui est-ce? Il est à peine plus âgé qu'elle, il a 9 ans de plus qu'elle.
Léon Gaumont was only 9 years older than she. He was an engineering wizard, a visionary, the first to come up with sound and color. Film was initially tinted by hand, then through a new process called trichrome. He opened the largest cinema in the world, the Gaumont Palace, and introduced a complete entertainment package, including newsreels.
Alice Guy, que lui apporte-t-elle?
Alice Guy contributed her enthusiasm, her energy. For the first time in the world, a film would be written, produced, and directed by the same person. And 70 years before the new wave, even before the phrase entered the vocabulary, we had a cinéma d'auteur. She used the techniques of color and sound that Léon Gaumont developed to make films that have come down to us today.
Bonjour, dites-moi, Rosine, ma belle voisine, d'où venez donc tout ce bruit chez vous cette nuit? Vous battiez-vous, ma charmante, étiez-vous souffrante? Je vous entendais gémir, je n'ai pas pu dormir.
The Gaumont Company had two parents. He, the engineer, the spirit of geometry. She, well-read, the creator, the spirit of finesse. Thus was born a major corporation.
Volez aux une tasse de thé, le galant fait va cloquer. Soit vous vous apprêtez à me dire des choses cruautés. Volez aux une tasse de thé, puis ajoutant ses pâtés. Maintenant, comme c'est mon Dieu, c'est dans ta gueule, ça vaudra mieux.
Alice directed over 100 of these forerunners of the music video between 1900 and 1907. Nearly 30 years before Hollywood got around to introducing the talkies at the end of the 20s. She found the creative and technical challenges offered by moving pictures tremendously stimulating. But there were obstacles. As she wrote in her autobiography, I had been left to work everything out by myself in the beginning, to break new ground. But as soon as my department became profitable, there was an attempt to push me aside. However, I defended my position, and thanks to the support of the chairman, Monsieur Eiffel, who always encouraged me with kindness, the board of directors acknowledged my efforts and unanimously decided to leave me in charge.
In France, the technicians who worked with me in the studio were always very pleasant. But the head of the workshop was a man called Decaux, and we did not get along at all, so much so it is just between us. When I made La Passion, my biggest film in France, I worked with an excellent set designer named Ménessier. One cold winter night, Decaux went into the workshop, removed all our completed sets, and chopped them up for firewood. That is one example.
Her greatest success in France was her film of the life and passion of Christ. It was a very long film for 1906, 35 minutes. There were 25 different sets and hundreds of extras. It made a tremendous impression when it was released, and even today, certain aspects of the film stand out as extraordinary.
J'ai une véritable passion pour la Passion d'Alice Guy.
I am passionate about Alice Guy's La Passion. Several early production companies made versions of the Passion of Christ. Alice Guy's is in a class by itself because of her exceptionally sophisticated staging. I would go so far as to say that Alice Guy's Life of Christ is nothing short of a miracle. Take, for example, the scene in which Mary Magdalene washes the feet of Christ. Over and above the main action, there are several bits of background action going on that open the image and let it breathe. Look at the lighting. Like the action, it too is in several layers, intensifying the perspective and creating a depth of field. The main action in the foreground is in shadow, while the background, behind the arches, is brightly lit.
À l'époque du cinéma des premiers temps, on avait souvent recours à un bonimenteur.
In the early days, movie houses often employed a dramatic commentator to stand at the foot of the screen and tell the story as the images flicked by. Judas Iscariot, having betrayed Jesus, arrives with a group of soldiers disguised as ordinary citizens in order to approach our Lord without arousing suspicion.
La Passion was your film?
Yes.
Because I believe there's a mistake in l'histoire du cinéma.
Yes, it is attributed to Jassé.
Who was your assistant?
Yes.
Grandmother has been completely and consistently ignored by most historians of the early days of cinema. Her works are often mentioned and frequently praised. But unfortunately, most reference books were compiled at a period when credit for her films, such as The Passion, was routinely given to others. Even people who never directed a film have been credited with Alice Guy's films.
For 11 years, Alice Guy was head of production at Gaumont. She supervised script preparation, set design, costumes. She oversaw the work of all of the company's film directors. In addition, she was herself a director and very often a scriptwriter. It is absolutely incredible that a man, Léon Gaumont, gave such enormous responsibilities to a woman 50 years before women had the right to vote in France. One reason for this, no doubt, is that he didn't realize, no more than anybody else, the phenomenal importance that cinema would have in only a few years. The fact that Guy was a woman, in my opinion, is partly responsible for her absence from many film histories. And yet it was she who, along with Ferdinand Zecca at Pathé, was one of the first heads of production in a major studio. It was she who set the Gaumont house style, for example, by using real locations in many of her films. It was she who trained the other pioneering filmmakers at Gaumont, such as Louis Fayard. For Guy, cinema was a process of exploration and discovery. She is one of the most important figures in the history of French cinema, and it is really sad that she is so little known today.
My grandmother, whom everyone called Mademoiselle Alice, had only one true love throughout those years, the cinema. Then at 33, she met the head of the Gaumont agency in Berlin, Herbert Blaché-Bolton.
We had talking pictures, but talkies are very tricky because of the two components, the projector and the talking part. They must be perfectly synchronized, and our clients sometimes required assistance. Gaumont was unable to make a trip to Germany and wanted me to go in his place. I said, I cannot go, I do not speak a word of German. He then told me, yes, you will go. You will take Blaché as your guide and translator. And that is what happened. We spent 2 or 3 weeks visiting clients to explain the process, to get things well underway, and...
You got married?
We did not marry then, but he asked me to marry him. I said, I shall have to think about it. I didn't want to leave France, nor did I wish to marry an Englishman. The English are not noted for their joie de vivre.
Though she was very open-minded and far ahead of her times in her work, she remained primly Victorian in other areas. In particular, she had a number of very fixed ideas, which, luckily, she was able to overcome.
I told Gaumont, I have a surprise for you, I'm getting married. He said, I have a surprise for you too, I am sending you to America to introduce the talking picture. He had already chosen Blaché to go. And so we went to the United States.
Alice wrote that she was leaving her family and her country with a heavy heart, convinced that she was giving up the work she loved forever. The Americas she found took a bit of getting used to. She didn't speak the language, she knew no one, and even the cinema was different from the one she knew. She wrote that in the United States, parlor kinetoscopes were all the rage. These devices had no projector. One viewer at a time watched an endless loop of film wind past a magnifying lens.
Gaumont came over to set things up. He purchased a little studio in Flushing on Long Island, and he began. He wanted to make talking pictures, musicals in particular, and he gave the job to my husband. I helped, of course, but I was not his employee, and that was fortunate, for if I had been, I should never have been able to begin my own studio.
They stayed briefly in Cleveland and then moved to the town of Flushing near New York City. A few months later, switching from creation to procreation, grandmother gave birth to her first child, Simone. She settled down at home as a wife and mother, but it wasn't long before she felt the pull of the cinema. My Aunt Simone, or Simmy, was only 2 when grandmother went back to film production. On September 7th, 1910, she founded her own studio, Solange. Grandmother loved tearjerkers, sentimental stories like Falling Leaves, the tale of a little girl whose older sister is gravely ill. The heroine overhears the doctor telling her mother that by the time the trees have lost their leaves, the ailing child will be dead. Hoping to save her sister's life, the little girl slips out at night to tie the leaves back on the trees. Her first films in the United States were enormously successful, and when people learned that the head of Solange Films was a woman, grandmother became headline news. In 1912, she was the only woman in the U.S. earning over $25,000 a year, and the press felt she deserved every penny. Solange owes the success it has enjoyed since its early days entirely to one major asset: Madame Blaché's mastery of cinematic technique. The result has been excellent production standards, both photographically and artistically. The leading figure in the world of cinema could one day be a woman, and that woman will be Alice Blaché. Now rich and famous, happy with a husband she loved and a child she adored, grandmother, heavily pregnant in this photo, proceeded to expand both her studio and her family at once. The baby, my father Reginald, and the new premises both burst on the scene in 1912. At its new site, Solange would become the largest studio in the United States.
We bought a piece of land in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which was the major film center of the day.
Hollywood was still not developed?
Oh, no, not at all.
The action was all in New York, New Jersey.
Hollywood was a small town where they put signs on the doors: no dogs or actors.
This was before wartime energy restrictions pushed film studios west to the year-round sunshine of Hollywood. My grandmother was much loved by the people she worked with. She brought her children to the studio and ate with the crew. It was all one big happy family. She was admired not only for her charm, but also for her talent as a director and her expertise in the cinema. She was always willing to share technical knowledge she had acquired in Paris with American directors of photography. She was a mine of information in the cinematic world of the day.
Early film reviewers, early film commentators, they were lavish in their praise of Alice Guy Blache's artistic accomplishments. They praised her sets, her use of natural locations. There seemed to be nothing she couldn't accomplish. After all, she'd built her own studio. So it was no big deal for her to have ditches dug, even to tame wild animals. There seemed to be no challenge that this extraordinary woman would not take up and would not succeed in accomplishing. Alice Guy Blache strived for increasingly more spectacular scenes, for more difficult stunts. She knew that was what the audiences wanted, it was what the early reviewers appreciated in her films. It's very hard for us, a contemporary audience, to go back 80 or more years and to understand just how sophisticated these films appeared to audiences back then. We have to bear in mind there were no such animals as stunt people. The actors, the actresses, they did their own stunts. Or else they'd go to the circus, to circus performers, to daredevils, to perform any sort of special tricks that might be needed. Many of the early filmmakers, they used models. When Alice Guy Blache wanted to blow up a boat, she used a real boat. She didn't worry about the danger, and in fact, her husband, Herbert Blache, was seriously injured in the explosion. We have to bear in mind that what today seems a cliché was not a cliché back then. Pioneers such as Alice Guy Blache, they were discovering cinema, they were discovering the potential of filmmaking. What they discovered, we now take for granted. We now use as part of the everyday process of filmmaking. Why, even the star system. That began back in the early years of this century when filmmakers such as Alice Guy Blache, they would hire a group of performers who would stay with them, and gradually their names, their faces became known, and they became stars.
I worked with marvelous stars. Petrova, for example. She was very popular because of her great beauty and her elegant carriage. She was a theater actress, quite a woman. One day, I wanted her to play a scene of jealousy. She said, "Madam, I never do scenes of jealousy. When the bloom is off the rose, it is I who cast it aside." I said, "Ah, indeed."
One of the first major actresses created by the star system was Olga Petrova, very popular in the teens and 1920s, but totally forgotten today. She was almost unique in the film industry in that she was a feminist. She would only play strong women on screen, surgeons, doctors, intellectuals. Alice Guy Blache first directed Madame Petrova in 1915 in a film called The Tigress, and together the two women made 4 other films together. It must have been a formidable collaboration. I remember back in the mid-1970s when Alice Guy Blache's autobiography first appeared, Madame Petrova wrote me a fascinating letter about working with the director.
Since I didn't know anything about directing or directors, the question of the filmmaker's sex never occurred to me. If it had, I would have concluded that as shrewd a businessman as the producer Weber wouldn't risk investing in a neophyte like me if he wasn't sure of Madame Blache's abilities. She never lost her dignity or calm during rehearsals and shooting. She had a velvet glove, but was capable of using an iron hand if necessary. Personally, I never saw her use it in the 4 films she directed me in. I never heard her shout into the megaphone. She obtained better results by getting her artists to obey and respect her.
I worked with a French actor, the brother of Capellani, and I put signs all around my studio which said, "Be natural." That is all I wanted from my actors. And he said to me, "Do you achieve that?" It took me 10 years to learn to be natural.
Be natural. You know, it seems such obvious advice today, but for film actors and actresses back in the teens, it was anything but. Back then, they posed for a motion picture, just as you'd pose for a still photograph. They were shot full body, and they pantomimed. But by telling her performers to be natural, Alice Guy was able to move in for close-ups. She was able to show body movement, expression. Be natural. With those 2 simple words, Alice Guy Blache transformed the art of screen acting for all time.
Mummy filled her scrapbooks with articles from the period, with criticisms, but she didn't really place much faith in critics. She preferred to mingle herself with the audience and to gather their impressions from what she heard. As for the articles about her, Mummy said they were often quite informative. She learned many details about her own beginnings, her background, her family, from the imaginations of her commentators. But really she hated falsehood, and she tried to correct everything herself. She would correct the people, and she would write in the margins of written work to correct things. If she were here, she'd have a good deal to say about me.
Academics became interested in Alice Guy Blache early on and invited her to give lectures. Having been the only woman filmmaker in the world for 17 years, she was something of a curiosity. Alice was in favor of women getting the vote. As early as 1912, she told a newspaper interviewer that women were ready for it. But having been raised as a member of the Victorian bourgeoisie, Alice certainly couldn't be a feminist the way we understand it today. But everything about her career, everything she did and said, affirmed that women were the equal of men. In 1914, Alice wrote in the film journal, Moving Picture World, "It has long been a source of wonder to me that many women have not seized upon the wonderful opportunities offered to them by the motion picture art to make their way to fame and fortune as producers of photodramas. Of all of the arts, there is probably none in which they can make such splendid use of talents, so much more natural to a woman than to a man, and so necessary to its perfection." She even made 2 feminist fables. Unfortunately, neither of them seems to have survived, but one can nevertheless detect in some of her films that have been conserved a different perspective on the world. One could even say a female perspective.
During the First World War, big conglomerates began buying up small film production companies, a move which was to influence the entire future of American cinema. Perhaps believing that grandfather would be better able to navigate through the minefields of fierce commercial rivalry, my grandparents made major changes in their lives. Grandfather left Gaumont and founded a new company, Blaché Features, and bit by bit, grandmother handed over the reins of power. However, grandfather's negotiating skills were no match for his rivals. The story goes that without consulting his wife, he practically gave away the rights to one of her films to a distributor who had convinced him it was worthless. This film, The Lure, was one of the biggest box office hits of its day. Grandmother said that it didn't take much to make a man question his wife's talent. After 1915, films, or photodramas as they were called, began to get longer. Grandmother directed what became known as feature-length films for a number of companies such as Popular Plays and Players, U.S. Amusement Corporation, and Paray Pictures. She loved sweeping melodramas, but her favorite films were love stories with a happy ending. Yet her own love story did not end happily. Liberated he may have been with regards to his wife's career, but in other respects grandfather was a conformist. In his mid-40s, he took off for California with his leading lady, leaving wife and children behind. In an attempt to patch things up, Alice joined him briefly in Hollywood and even worked for him on 2 films. But the marriage was doomed. Life became professionally and personally intolerable beside a man whom she still loved, but whose affections had turned elsewhere. At the time of my grandparents' separation, independent companies throughout the United States were being bought up, and they received several tempting offers. However, they didn't approve of the way the big conglomerates operated. According to Alice, there was a lot of dishonesty and intimidation, so they turned down arrangements which might have proved extremely lucrative. In any event, working together became more and more difficult, and in the throes of a crumbling marriage, grandmother had no strength for battle on other fronts.
I found the record of the auction with what seem now quite pitiable little prices for things.
The auction of what?
The auction of her furnishings when she was obliged to sell her studio.
The studio at Fort Lee was seized to cover back taxes that the new tenants had neglected to pay, and all my grandmother's possessions were auctioned. She watched her whole life being sold for a pittance and carted off.
You lived in Hollywood as well. Did you go to Los Angeles?
Yes.
When did you go?
To Hollywood? Oh dear, I do not remember very well.
Hollywood was probably etched in grandmother's memory, but it's easy to understand why she would try to forget this dark period in her life. For it was in Hollywood that she lost her husband, her career, and most of her illusions. She wrote, "They say that America takes back whatever it gives you. Hopeless and penniless, I resolved to return to France with my children." She moved in with her sister and niece and tried on several occasions to get back into film. Though she was only 49, it was too late. France had forgotten all about her. So she focused all her attention on her children. My Aunt Simmy, whom I called Tante C, said that grandmother moved heaven and earth to raise her 2 children in some degree of comfort. She wrote children's stories and magazine articles under various masculine pen names.
Now, this is a story she wrote
I see.
in intention for children, promoting a mistaken myth that wolves will chase people in their sleigh, and you have to throw somebody out to distract the wolves.
She would only sign her own name to screenplays. Unfortunately, none of her scripts found a producer during the hard years between the wars in Europe, where money for film production was scarce and opportunities for career women even scarcer. Later, Tante C got a job at the American Embassy and began to support her mother. Grandmother moved several times within Europe, to Belgium, Switzerland, and then back to France, wherever Simmy was posted. She began jotting down her memoirs and also began to search for her films.
Do you still have copies of your films?
They cannot be found, unfortunately. The films I made in France cannot be found. My American films were not released under my name. They were released under the name of the distribution company, but I am on my way to find them, and I am sure to succeed.
My grandmother was 83. Traveling alone by plane, even taking the subway, held no terrors for her, especially when she was on the trail of her own cinematic past. She was one of the most prolific filmmakers in the early days of cinema. She had a hand in an estimated 700 films in France and the U.S. as director, scriptwriter, producer, or all three. She directed dramas and westerns and a slew of slapstick comedies before Max Sennett, Charlie Chaplin, and Buster Keaton, whose film debut was in one of Grandfather's films. She loved to experiment. She worked in almost every style, format, and genre.
I made westerns, all kinds of things. I even learned to twirl a lasso.
Exhaustive research has found only a scant 50 films scattered all over the world. Unfortunately, Grandmother herself was unable to trace any of her American films and only found a few from her days at Gaumont. What does remain in America is a branch of her family. My father, Reggie, my mother, and I lived in the States. Grandmother didn't like our being so far away. She wanted to bring the family together again. Despite repeated efforts, she was also unable to find a publisher for her autobiography during her lifetime. The book came out a few years after her death.
She tried to publish it as what it in fact is, simply a few memories from the earliest part of her life, you know, with a few sketches of the later part, just barely indicated. She tried to publish this, and she was rejected over and over.
I kind of remember
Yes.
Simi saying that, you know, being quite angry
Oh,
that
they were quite cruel,
that they
yes.
hadn't published it, and it was so long.
There were so
coming.
many of the publishers. Well, Mommy, you know, was not really used to dealing with publishers, book publishers, although she had published a good deal in magazines. Many of them would lead her on and pretend to be considering this very carefully, and then ask her for a lot of money.
Oh.
And,
to try
you know, this, yes.
In order to publish it, they
well,
asked her
yes,
for
you know, a vanity publication
Oh,
it would
yeah.
have been. And she was too proud for that.
Right.
And so she would try somebody else. And this happened really several times, and unfortunately it would take a long time each time while
Right.
the little show went on between the publisher and poor Mummy waiting in
Right.
the wings, you know.
Victor Blaché, who recently wrote a book on my grandmother and who met with her over a number of years, said that despite all the troubles she'd endured, she was not in the least bitter. The only title she claimed was that of the first woman filmmaker in the world, a title no one could dispute. After all, she was the only woman filmmaker for 17 years, but one which she was forced to defend more than once on both sides of the Atlantic. Grandmother and Tansi came back to the States for good in 1964. After suffering a series of strokes, Grandmother died in a nursing home on March 24, 1968, at the age of 95. Till then, her mind had been sharp, but after the strokes, she couldn't remember her own name, much less her life as a filmmaker. She had joined in the collective amnesia that shrouded her life and work for so many years.
Having lived with her all my life, I would like to add a personal note. Mother was passionate and generous in nature, endowed with exceptional energy and youthfulness. She was open-minded and always interested in scientific or literary discoveries. Her profound love of nature and enthusiasm for life were contagious. She was more a friend to me than a mother, and I owe her most of the happiness I have left.
Nothing is left of what she built in Fort Lee. No monument bears her name. A humble plaque in this sad memorial garden is all that marks her passage on this earth.